Well, good evening.
Good evening.
Tonight is October the 1st, 1984. We're in Ottawa, Canada for the Edward Sapir Centenary Conference. And I'm David Sapir of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. And the University of Anthropology at the University of Florida, in conjunction with the Wenner-Gren, is putting together a videotape library of interviews on the history of anthropology. And tonight we're very fortunate to have Professor William Fenton, who is an anthropologist affiliated, has been affiliated in the past with the State University of New York and Albany and other places as well. And he is going to talk to us about his life in anthropology. And I'll start off by saying that you're known to the world as Mr. Iroquois. And I hope you will tell us a lot about that. But maybe if we can start with what got you into anthropology to begin with, way back in your salad days.
If we went back to the beginning, we'd have to go back to my childhood. I grew up outside of New York, in Rochelle. But my family came from Western New York. And father being a New York City school teacher in fine arts, and having a house in New Rochelle that we could only afford to live in part of the year, the whole family migrated to Western New York to revisit the family farm that some Fentons had taken up after the American Revolution. The farm was midway between the two principal settlements of the Seneca Nation, the largest body of the Iroquois in Western New York. My grandfather had known Indians. They had the habit of stopping to camp on the farm and traveling between Cattaraugus, over near Lake Erie, and Allegheny, the big oxbow in southwestern New York, where the Allegheny Reservation is. The Indians always refer to, if you're at Cattaraugus, Allegheny's the other side. If you're in Allegheny, Cattaraugus is the other side. And apparently this stopping over at the Fenton farm had been going on for a long time. My grandfather knew Indians, hunted with them, even went to the Civil War with some of them. And as a child, I remember these people who had come by, and to me they were by far the most interesting visitors who came to the farm in the summer. And on the top of this old Victorian farmhouse, we had a museum. The south room was the Indian collection, and the north room was geology and botany and things like that my father's sisters had put together. Besides the Indians coming, various archaeologists and ethnologists came by, like Warren King Moorhead from Andover, and Arthur C. Parker, who himself is Seneca, who was then at the New York State Museum. And they would sit around and look at the artifacts that my grandfather had plowed out of the soil. And in the cheese box were the real pièce de résistance, these two great Iroquois masks, false faces, which no one had, too much knowledge, but I was curious about them. Well, this migration, like the summer removal of the Eskimos, and summer on the barren grounds, winter on the ice floes that we performed of suburban New York in the winter and Conewango Valley in the summer, went on until I was 16. And we used to visit the Allegheny Reservation, and father being a painter, used to do landscapes down there, and I got to know some Senecas. He also collected false faces because his friends at the Salmagundi Club in New York were sculptors. And it was a custom there at Salmagundi to have each member to put on a one-man show of some kind, usually a hobby. And so father had a an exhibit of his swell space collection one winter. Well, I went off to Dartmouth College after high school. Thought I was bound for the School of Business Administration and Finance, and in fact I spent one aborted year, my senior year, in this combined graduate program, which I cordially disliked, and ended up in plummeting from the dean's list to probation in one semester. The crash came along that fall, and all my contemporaries who were the sons of money people were in great distress. I had no background for this, whatever, coming from an academic family, and cordial dislike for the kind of economics that were being taught. So I began to think about, what I really liked, and I'd had a course in social theory with McCloak and DeGrange, and I'd taken it as a junior, and some of the class were seniors, and I remember there were two chaps in particular who flanked me in the class. One was Leonard Doob, who became a psychologist at Yale. The other was John Dickey, who later became president of Dartmouth.
I took a course from Leonard Doob.
Did you?
Yeah.
Well, they were both knocking off 95s and 98s in the quizzes. That bothered me. I'd get an 80 or an 85. I finally went around one afternoon to see McCloak and DeGrange and said, what do I have to do to bat in that league? Well, along in the spring, DeGrange started talking about Boas after he got done with the positivists. And so I went back and took my senior year over in college because a guy came there to teach anthropology named Robert McKinnon, one of Dixon's students. McKinnon worked among the Athabasca. And the following year I intended to go to Harvard, but I had run out of scholarship money, and it was the bottom of the Depression. We lived in Westport, Connecticut. That was before Westport was fashionable. It was just a place where people like my father went who wanted to paint. So I went down to New York one day and talked to Clark Whistler at the American Museum of Natural History, whom I had known casually because of an interest in what he had done. He said, well, I teach 2 days a week at Yale. Why don't you come up there the day after tomorrow, and I'll be there. I'll send you over to see the dean. He said, also, there's a man named Sapir coming here from Chicago. I thought to myself, I'd seen a book in the Baker Library at Dartmouth called Language, which I'd looked into, hadn't really read. And so I went up to New Haven. Whistler sent me over to see Toby Cross, who was Wilbur Cross, later governor of Connecticut. He was an English professor, and he was dean of the graduate school. It was in one of the old Yale buildings down in the quadrangle, Connecticut Hall. And I went in there, and he said, did you go to college? And I said, yes. You got a transcript? I said, yes. I handed it to him, and he looked at it a little while. He said, I like a transcript like this, it's honest. He said, you didn't do very well your sophomore, junior years, or sophomore year, but you got better your junior. He said, what were you doing? I said, well, I was running track. I was out of town a good deal. And he said, it shows. And he said, why do you want to go to Yale? I said, frankly, I wanted to go to Harvard. And I said, but I can't afford it. And we live down in Westport, and I can commute. Well, he said, that's the worst reason for going to Yale I ever heard of. But you're in.
That's nice.
No SATs, no graduate record examinations. It was all very informal. Cross was remarkable because he never forgot anybody. Years later, I'd see him in the library, even after he was governor. And there'd be this great Lincoln Wednesday parked out in front of Sterling Library, and a couple of these tough-looking Polish Connecticut State Police manning it. And inside, while Toby would be holding court at the catalog, library catalog. We'd go by and he'd say, "Hey, how's your problem coming along? You know, how's your thesis?" And he knew he was really with it. He knew just exactly what everyone was doing. He was a good governor. He was a good dean. Well, so I ended up in New Haven. I took a course in Whistler.
Right.
Yes.
Get the year?
1931. It was a year that Edward Sapir came there, your father. I met him briefly, but I didn't take any courses with him the first year. And,
who was at Yale at that time?
Yeah, he came.
No, but who was there altogether?
Who else was there? George Peter Murdoch had come over from sociology into the new anthropology department. He taught a course called ethnology, which we all took. Keeney Osgood had just come on from Chicago and was at the Peabody Museum in the room of George Grant McCurdy, the prehistorian. Whistler was at the Institute, and we had a visitor named Turnwald from Germany. And so some of us signed up for Turnwald's class because it was over at the Institute. And I took Whistler's seminar, and I took Murdoch's.
The Institute is the Human Relations?
Institute of Human Relations was on, let's see, it was at the east side or the west side?
Over by the hospital.
Over by the hospital. And a part of it, I mean, Whistler was there, and there were graduate fellows were there. And most graduate students, after they got established, had an office there. It was very nice. And then your father, Edward Sapir, and other faculty, 2 or 3, as in later, the next year or so, were in the Hall of Graduate Studies, where the Anthropology department was. And Osgood was over at the Peabody Museum.
Who was your cohort? Was Ben Rouse with you?
Ben Rouse was an undergraduate.
At that time?
At that time, and he was an assistant in the Peabody Museum. And in that first year I was there, other students included Frelick Rainey, who come from Chicago originally. He was interested in archaeology. He was at the museum. Let's see, who else? There's a fellow named Jess Spirer who came on from Pittsburgh, and I don't remember whether he was there the first year or the second year. There's Clellan Ford, had been a Yale undergraduate with Murdoch. And he was in Murdoch's seminar in ethnology. And he was, you know, the founder later of the Human Relations Area Faculty. And, well, anyway, we all took Murdoch's seminar and wrote papers for it.
What was he teaching?
He was teaching ethnology. It was just a general course in ethnology.
Like his primitive contemporaries? Or primitive?
Yeah, exactly. Different cultures. And each of us had a culture, and we had to write a term paper on it. And
what did you do? Iroquois?
no, I didn't do Iroquois. I did the Indians of southern New England. And at the end, Murdoch had us, he gave a criticism merciless criticism of each of us. And then he said, well, there are a couple of papers here that are worth reading, and he had me read mine. I think, I don't know if Rainey read the other, someone else wrote another.
Had Wes LeVar come yet?
No, not until the next year. The second year, Wes LeVar came from Princeton with a straight A record. He was a brilliant guy. And Dave Mandelbaum came from Northwestern. He'd been a Herskovitz student. And Alfred Hudson, who was an old Yale, he wrote on the crew. He was interested in Kazakhstan. Raymond Kennedy, who had sold Buicks in Sumatra, made some money. Jungle Jim, as they call him. Ned Hill, who was a sort of a refugee from Berkeley, came.
Johnny?
Pardon?
Johnny White?
No, not until later. Let's see. Willard Park. Just on the Paiute, Pabiazzo. He was from Berkeley. Well, that was the group of the ethnologists, pretty much. And by this time, Rouse, as you asked about, was a first-year graduate student and working at the museum.
Now, who covered archaeology in those days?
Pardon?
Was it McCurdy covering archaeology?
No, McCurdy was no longer teaching. McCurdy was, he was emeritus, and Osgood had taken his place. Osgood was teaching European prehistory, which I took, and also a course on the American Indian. I got off on the wrong foot with Osgood for a number of reasons, but one of them was I said I didn't think I'd rather take something else because I'd had the American Indian with McKinnon at Dartmouth. That was really the wrong thing to have said because he and McKinnon were rivals in the Athabascan field. And the second thing that got me off wrong with Osgood was he held forth one day about the Ivy League, and having been an undergraduate at Dartmouth and having visited, I think, most of the locker rooms of the Ivy League, I thought I knew something about it. And I told him he had it all wrong. It didn't work the way he thought it did at all. But it, you know, very much like Malinowski's cooler ring, actually. Yeah. Well, Osgood had a way of, I don't know this I knew somebody else later from Chicago of his time. I think they all emulated Hutchins, and they had a sort of sardonic or sarcastic wit.
They still do.
And a way of, making people very uncomfortable.
Hasn't changed.
Osgood and I had we had a, sort of it was just a civil standoff, that's all, for 2 or 3 years, until I came up for the laurels, so that's another story. Well, the second year I took 2 seminars with Edward Sapir. One in the fall was on social organization. And he said, I want you to do the Iroquois. He said, Goldenweiser worked on that and I'll tell you about that tomorrow. Every one of us had, a culture to do. I remember Mandelbaum did Eskimos. Somebody else did a Samoan society. And the idea was to come in there with your stuff pretty well organized and get it going and keeping it going. And if possible, keeping the initiative and the momentum. Because once Professor Sapir got his critical clause in the year, you'd had it.
How was he on social organization?
He was good.
Yeah.
He was really good. And, well, I had excellent material. I went through Morgan, I went through Goldenweiser's summary reports. And I had the thing all lined out. I had diagrams on the blackboard. When the thing was all over, he said, I want you to come in my office. He said, you're going to field this summer. I've got a little money. And you ought to go up the Iroquois. So you've got an interest in it. Nobody's done anything, and Goldenweiser, kind of flunked out on it. It's worth making a field.
So Dad got you into the Iroquois?
Yeah.
But it was also your family background.
Well, true, I had this interest, but it sort of got rekindled, by this. When I began to read about it, and I also was interested in knowing about the false faces and the Medicine Society. In fact, I've just finished a 600-page book on the false faces of the Iroquois, which University of Oklahoma Press is going to do, and which is all the stuff that I accumulated over the years, things on which I've written papers, you know, that you threw out, pursuing wolves. In fact, your father told me something once, I'll never forget. He said, write a summary paper of what you know about the field, even though you aren't ready to write the definitive thing, because it'll be the best thing we have for a long while. And I did. I wrote this. I wrote one on Iroquois masks for the old Scientific Monthly, and Paul Radin saw it, and that's how I met him. He was interested. And I went down to Columbia one day to participate in a seminar of Meade and Benedict's on competition and cooperation and primitive society. I ended up in a book. Bill Quain was writing the Iroquois chapter. They got me down there as kind of an informant. I'd been in the field 2 years or 2 seasons. And I met old Boas that day, quite by accident. I was talking with Alexander Lesser out in the hall, and Lesser had befriended me at a first meeting of the AAA up in Andover. And while we were talking, my Boas stuck his head out of his office. He looked at me and he said, "You're Fenton." And I said, "Yes." He said, "I knew your father." And I thought, well, that was possible, because father was around Columbia at one time. And he said, "Edward told me about you. Come in." I went in there, scared to death. Sat down in the presence of, you know, God Almighty. And he looked at me and he said, "What do you know about Iroquois verbs?" And I did know that he had written a short paper on Mohawk verbs, stuff he did on a train ride with some Mohawk ironworkers going from Montreal down to New York once. And, well, I didn't know much about Iroquois verbs. I had a lot of vocabulary that I picked up living with the Senecas. But as far as the verb system, I was completely baffled by it. Well, that was my encounter with Boas. Well, get back to New Haven. I think that it was the second or the third year Leslie Sapir came there. And let's see, my first summer after graduate school, to backtrack a bit, there was a thing called the Laboratory of Anthropology at Santa Fe. It gave, you know, scholarships for field training in anthropology, and it was a trip to the Hopi, which Egan, Kenoid, and George Devereaux, but Jeff Spire, this young guy who later went into psychology, was at Yale, got the nod for that. And, but Whistler got me in the archaeology party in the summer '32 and sent me out with Duncan Strong. Worked at Signal Butte and up in South Dakota on the Mandan sites. So I got my fill of archaeology that summer. We had Sioux Indians who came down and watched the dig. I remember one day I was digging a pit, and one of these storage pits. These bison bones kept coming out. They had scoring on them. We had a sort of a half-literate nitwit that was living with the Sioux who could speak some English. And he was a sort of crazy bear, this old Sioux shaman, who sat on and he talked about the Rees and how they killed the Rees, and what bastards they were. And I asked him about this, and he said, well, this was a game, you know, that in the wintertime they skated these things on the snow. Well, I'd seen Iroquois snowsnake play in the winter. And so I thought, you know, this is a hell of a lot more interesting than archaeology, just talking, interviewing Indians, you know, who really know something about, you know, the culture that they're involved. And I got converted right then and there, and that was a year before.
Well, you were into archaeology to begin.
What?
You thinking of archaeology?
I was very interested in archaeology at the start, but that was my first field season. Then it was the next year that I went to the Senecas.
Oh, I see.
At the behest of ES. And I spent 2 summers out there. Summers of 33 and 34.
Out in the Southwest.
No, and I didn't go to the Southwest. I went, so I'm afraid I've confused this a bit with the chronology, because I forgot about the field trip I did to the Plains in archaeology. That was 32.
All right.
That was after my first year of graduate work.
Okay.
After the second year, I went to the Senecas in 33. I went there in 33 and in the winter for the Midwinter Festival, and in 34 for the second summer. And began to get, you know, a corpus of material for, well, what was going to be a dissertation. I thought I was going to do all of social organization and ceremonial life for a dissertation. I ended up in writing a dissertation on the Eagle Dance, which was one of the medicine societies, which afforded an opportunity to fulfill a requirement that Sapir assigned to us in the seminar on culture and personality, was to devise a situation which individuals that participated in the culture and show how the happenings varied in terms of who participated and who was there. And when I began to watch these medicine society rites, which involved kind of bragging on the part of participants, they would stop the song and tell stories or tell jokes on other people. But originally it had been a war record recitation. But each of these events differed in its content depending upon who was there, who were the participants. And so I got in, you know, into this thing on the individual in this culture and the culture itself. So I set out to explain 2 instances of ceremonies I saw, and then the history of that ceremony in that community, its relation to the same ceremony in other Iroquois communities. And then ultimately I tied the Eagle Dance to the Calumet Dance and got into one of these grand distributional things like Wesley Spear, and the things he loved. And I got concerned about the kind of history that one could infer from distributions, and in the Iroquois case, so I could develop real solid documentary proof of when these things occurred. So from that I got into, from the culture to the ethnohistory. Well, what do you want to know next?
Well, let's take a break. I need another drink. Okay, let's get back to those courses that you took with that. Now, you told us about social anthropology one, or the social organization one, I should say. And then the second one you took that year was religion.
Religion.
What did they have you do then? Is there anything that sort of stuck in your mind from that course?
It was run pretty much the same way, except that, as I recall, your father lectured some, and but again, each of us did projects, which he monitored. So, that year I also took phonetics. And I was telling somebody today that was really fun because it was a little bit formidable in one way. Because the room was full of people who were really sophisticated as linguists. I mean, Carl Woodland was there as a graduate fellow. Morris Swadish, Murray Haas, Murray Yamano, Worf on occasion when he wasn't working. And then the rest of us were a bunch of Yahoo ethnologists, you know, who really were just doing this because we were expected to. Most of us had, or at least half of us, had no background in linguistics. We may have had some undergraduate language courses, I did French, for example. informants. There was a fellow named Philip Klamath who was known to some people here. I think I've said Mike Silverstein about him. Who was a Wishram, and that phonetically that was a very difficult language on those northwest coasts. And then Sapir did some Navajo and other languages. And after he'd explained the phonetic alphabet and so forth, and each of us would try to record these things and hear vowel length and glottal stops and back consonants. And those things that occur only in the land and the northwest coast languages.
Did they prepare you for the Iroquois voiceless vowels?
No, not at all. But for vowel length, yes. And then he would have each day, you know, after one of these sessions, one of us would have to go to the blackboard and put down what we thought we heard. And one of the non-linguists did rather well. Your father was always delighted. That really, you know, lit him up. And I remember Wes LeBar had a very good ear. And I have a good ear, but no structural sense. And I also took what passed for Introduction to Linguistics, but it was pretty advanced. And I never knew what was going on, because there was all this chit-chat at a very high level between these graduate fellows and the master. But going back to the Institute of Human Relations, by then I had an office over there. And I'd usually walk back with Vogelin and Morris Swadish. Morris was a born teacher. And he would explain to me what, as he called him, the old man, had been saying in the course and what had really been happening. And when I got in real trouble, I could always go in and talk to Morris and Mary Haas. And that was the only way I got through the course, by these tutorials. And Carl Vogelin was also very helpful, but very difficult to understand. Someone once said that, I think it was Tom Sibiak quoted somebody as saying that it was after a meeting at the Philosophical Society that I attended. Yeah, we stopped in front of Independence Hall, and I looked at Tom and I said, what the hell was Vogelin talking about? He said, don't you know? He said, spoken Vogelin is difficult. Written Vogelin is impossible. Well, I mean, Carl's a good friend of mine. I'm very fond of him. I must confess, I never could understand him. But Swadish was clear as crystal.
Oh, yeah.
And I got a Seneca informant to come down there. In fact, he was in some work camp in Connecticut, and we got him over at the Institute on Saturdays. Carl and Morris Swadish and I worked with him. I learned working with them what I wasn't hearing in the language and so forth. That was very useful.
Now, you started off with the Seneca.
Yeah.
Let's move into that.
Well, I started with the Senecas of the Seneca Nation. In the spring of '35, I passed my orals, and there was nothing then to do but write a dissertation. Well, meanwhile, I'd had no German as an undergraduate. German was a very rigid requirement at Yale, and you had to pass it off. And I kept kind of ducking this responsibility, and so I'd been president of the Yale Anthropology Club, and one of the speakers we had there was John Collier. John came up and gave a spiel, and he was going to incorporate anthropologists into the Indian Service after the model of the British Colonial Service, who used anthropologists in Africa.
Indirect rule?
Yeah.
Or
And so after the Pittsburgh meetings of the AAA, where I read a paper, I remember Collier was there, and a lot of high-level people talked with him about this. They were going to have an applied anthropology unit, they also offered a examination. In fact, the second summer I was in the field in 1934, I got this wire from Sapir's secretary saying, by all means take the examination for community worker, the civil service exam. Well, I took it, and among other things they asked was what kind of group experience or I'd had. Well, I'd coached freshman skiing in Dartmouth my 5th year when I should have been doing my senior year. And it was introductory skiing. I also skied on the team then. And so I got Mickey Mouse credits for that. I also had some summer camp work as a canoe counselor up in New England. I remember afterward meeting Al Lesser. Al said, I took that exam. He said, you got a higher grade than I did. I said, well, Al, it wasn't, you know, the thing wasn't graded on your intellectual ability at all. Or mine, I said, I got all these credits for these community activities I've been involved in, or athletic events. And so after, yeah, I passed it. And after well, after Collier was at Yale, gave his spiel, one day I got this wire from Collier. Would you accept the superintendency of the New York Indians? Gee, I looked at this thing. God, he was out of his mind.
No, wait a minute. Collier as the...
See, he was Commissioner of Indian Affairs.
Under Roosevelt at the time.
Yeah, under Roosevelt and under Harold Ickes. Under Harold Ickes.
And so he was going to put you in charge of...
He was going to put me in charge of the New York agency in Salamanca. And this wasn't something I really wanted to do.
Now, did you finish your graduate work by then?
I had finished my residence.
Without the dissertation?
Without the dissertation, without the German exam.
Oh, the German always gets in the people's way, doesn't it?
I didn't know what I was going to do. I went home and I showed it to my father, and he said, look, obviously somebody's confused you with somebody else. So you go to Washington. And he says, when you walk in there, he said, a lot of people are going to have egg on their face. But he said, they'll have to give you something. So I went down. I called Duncan Strong, and Duncan was a good friend. He was so too I got around, and that's exactly what happened. You can see the shock on people's faces when I walked in. I was 24 or 23, I think. And, well, anyway, they said, well, do you really want to be superintendent of the New York Indians? I said, no. And I said, but I took this community worker examination. I passed it. And, why don't you go up there and be a community worker and work at that for a year or so and see how you like it. And meanwhile, we'll make some decision. The agent was a superannuated guy who was a Republican. And he only had the job because he owed money to the banks, and the politicals who were tied him to the banks wanted to keep him on his Indian service salary so he could pay the interest on his loans. So I went up to the Seneca Nation, back up where I'd started, but I didn't want to work at Allegheny and Cattaraugus where I'd done field work. So I went up to Tonawanda, which was up on east of Buffalo on Fort Rochester. And they put me in charge of the Tonawanda and Tuscarora Indian reservations. One of the things I had to do right off the bat was to go around and explain the Wheeler-Howard Acts, the Indian Reorganization Act, and the Iroquois were dead against it. Finally, I saw I wasn't getting anywhere. So I wrote to Washington through the superintendent and said, look, they've got to get somebody up here that knows something about this legislation. So they sent up Henry Roclod, who was a Winnebago, educated at Yale after Haskell Institute. And Henry Rocloud and I drove around New York to various Indian groups, held these hearings where they were hostile. Remember that thing in Radin's Winnebago? You walk where the earth is narrow. Well, we walked where the earth is narrow for the better part of 3 weeks. And on one of these trips, on a long drive from Syracuse up to St. Regis, or Akwesasne up on near Cornwall Island, I turned to Rocloud and I said, "How did you come to go to Yale?" He said, "I never had a vision." He was a failure among the Winnebagos. He went off to boarding school without a vision, ended up with a Yale education. He was a marvelous human being. And a person of great equanimity. I mean, he really sort of saved my bacon. Well, I did that for 2.5 years. I found a tutor, a local physician who had formerly taught languages at Syracuse while he was going through medical school. He tutored me in German. We read Friederici's Sapir and Enoch of Krieger's Gebräuche in America. Great monograph written in 1906, on scalping and similar forms of warfare. Lord, I knew that thing by heart. And one day I'm back to New Haven as I was filing chapters in the dissertation, which I was writing while I was in the Indian Service. And your father examined me. He said, "You don't know much German, but you seem to learn a lot of Seneca." He said, "Officially they won't recognize Seneca here in the graduate school, but he said, you have worked through this text," and which I had. And he was right, I didn't know much German. I can read titles, bibliography. And anyway, I filed the dissertation. When that was over, I was ready to do something else, because I had decided that applied anthropology was really for the birds. I wasn't interested in it. I was interested in the old culture, and the Indians were happiest when they and I were talking about the old culture, because my informants were interested in it. And in fact, I had a committee at Tonawanda, which consisted of Jesse Cornplanter, who was my interpreter and a very learned guy. He'd been around anthropologists ever since he was a child. He did the original drawings for the book that Frederick Starr of Chicago put together to raise the money in Chicago to cast the Cornplanter Medal for Iroquois research, which was given by the County Historical Society. And Starr had come from Auburn. Well, Jesse, Elijah David, or 20 Kettles. Heenan Scroggs, who was preacher of the Handsome Lake religion. Oh, and all that. There were one or two others. Eddie Black was one of the chiefs. Because I did chapters on the Eagle Dance, I'd bring them down, talk them over with them. They were very interested. And I said, I got to get down to New Haven. They won't know much about this thing, but they'll know a lot about how it should be done. And so I went down and defended the dissertation. When I got back, I had a report to my committee at Tonawanda, who were really, they were really ego involved at this point, and the fact that I should finish.
Now wait a minute, these fellows how they sit in the local Seneca community?
Oh, these fellows well, two of them were chiefs. One of them was a lead chief. He was down in Dawi, one of the 8 Seneca sachems. 20 Kettles, or Elijah David, who was the leader of one moiety for the Longhouse ceremonies. Jesse Cornplanter was a great Seneca singer. And Eddie Black was a sub-chief and an orator.
That's pretty.
They were
pretty serious bunch.
They were really good. And
so what did they think of this Yankee into their affairs?
well, at the time, they I'd never had any anthropologists around messing around, not since Louis Morgan, when that was 9 years earlier. He'd worked there, and Parker had been out, and they all talked Seneca to me. I'd go around house to house, and the people, I get these streams of Seneca, you know, which I could hear, and I knew it was Seneca. I didn't always know what they were saying. And I went to ceremonies where I could, you know, follow the course of the formal speeches, as I'd taken the text of some of them. And the attitude of these old guys was that if I were that interested in their culture, I better damn sight get it straight. And they were always twitting younger guys among themselves who didn't spend any time listening. And they'd say, oh, this Hanyon, this pale face, you know, he knows this stuff. He can sing our songs. And what do you guys know? You wouldn't even listen. And that was the attitude then. Well, now, a couple of generations later, all these old men have gone out of their graves. And the people that didn't listen, a lot of them have gone to their graves, but their children are the new generation of now Indians. They're vitally interested in their old culture, but they resent people like me who have learned something about their culture, which they don't know. And they feel that, you know, I've alienated this material. I've taken away the songs. I've taken away the ceremonies. You know, it's going to some library, some museum, Library of Congress or whatever. And things have changed.
Well, let's keep going where you were back there. You had your professors with the Senate.
Yeah.
And after that, I mean, they saw you through your dissertation.
Yeah, they saw me through the dissertation. They also saw me through a crisis for the Union Service when somebody complained to a congressman that, you know, here was this guy that was up there messing around with the Longhouse people, not paying too much attention to that person's particular idea as to which way the Indians ought to move. And by this time, Collier had acquired a chap who was he didn't know what to do with. And usually in the Indian Service, when they got somebody in who was awfully good and they were mixed up about him, they sent him out to the field as a special agent or special reporter to look into some situation. There was a complaint about me. So this guy came up and talked to the Royalist Indians. And, I went down below and I told my committee that I told Eddie Black, I think it was, I said, look, Eddie, I'm in trouble. I said, this guy's up here. I said, I'll probably have to leave. I said, when this is over. He said, you don't worry about him at all. He says, go on and do what you're going to do today. We'll talk to him. Well, they kept that guy so busy the better part of 2 days that he was completely snowed, you know. He went back to Washington pretty confused about it all. I didn't get canned, and I was offered a job out in Wisconsin. And I didn't want to go to Wisconsin. I was then looking for an academic job. And your father met Lawrence Seeley, the then new president of St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, who had come from American University in Beirut to be the president there, at a meeting in Lake Placid. And Seeley said, apparently, Seeley was led to believe that I was just what they needed up there. So I was appointed instructor in anthropology at St. Lawrence. I'd never had an undergraduate course, man, just one anthropology course. I knew what a liberal arts college was. I'd never lived in a co-ed liberal arts college, but it was a nice place. St. Lawrence is a good place. It's a school with a lot of family loyalty, generation after generation returning. North Country boys going off the farms into St. Lawrence and into the banks and insurance companies in New York making good. People like Owen D. Young and so forth. And has a real tradition. So I bought books like crazy, taught anthropology, coached the first ski team at St. Lawrence, helped with the track team. Second year, none of Seeley's nuts, as they were called by the conservatives in the community, was promoted except me, and the whole athletic committee was behind me. Students said I was a hell of a lecturer, but I was a damn good ski coach. Well, I'd really, I skied in the Arlberg School. Hannah Schneeb's brought to Hanover. That was something I knew. I knew how to teach it. That was a lot of fun, though.
How long were you there?
3 semesters.
Is that when you went to Washington?
Yeah. See, the summer I was on the Great Plains in '32 with Duncan Strong. Matthew Sterling, the director of the Bureau of Ethnology, had come through and stayed in camp, and I talked with him. I'd met him. J.M.B. Hewitt died. He was an Iroquois, native Iroquois who was on the Bureau staff. And they were looking for someone to continue his work because he left a lot of unpublished texts from the Six Nations Reserve in Canada. So I got a wire from Sterling. Then I report to the Bureau of Ethnology in September. I'd just been made an assistant professor at St. Lawrence, and the salary at the Bureau of Ethnology was $1,000 more. And we just couldn't figure out what the hell we were going to do with $3,200, We soon found out. However, since they promoted me, I liked St. Lawrence, I offered to come back and teach that first semester, second year, and I did, and then I went to Washington in February. I arrived at the Bureau of Ethnology on February 4th, the day your father died. That was the day that our elder son was born. I never forgot it.
That was 39.
39. I was there in the Bureau through 1951.
12 years.
13 years.
13. Was how long did colony last? Just through the Roosevelt administration?
Yeah.
Did Truman keep going?
No. I don't remember exactly.
But no, what's the evolution of your work with the Seneca? Did you work also with the other nations?
No. After I went to the Bureau, when I began to take up Hewitt's work, I went up to Six Nations Reserve in Canada, where Hewitt had worked. Meanwhile, I had acquired Goldenweiser's papers, and I'm going to talk about that tomorrow, so I don't know. And I began to work on the League and its rituals, the Condolence Council, and ethnobotany, which was one of my interests.
Did you get deeply involved with any other nations besides the Seneca?
Yeah, I got deeply involved with the Six Nations of Grand River in Canada.
Yeah, but the Six Nations are sort of a group, right?
Well, the Six Nations are considered the Mohawk, Onondaga,
But they're all together.
Cayuga, and Senecas. The Senecas are the bigger than all the rest of them. So there are 3 big Seneca communities: Allegheny, Catawba, and Tonawanda in western New York. There's a small enclave of Onondagas at Syracuse, and a big group of Mohawks at St. Regis, and another group at Caughnawaga, opposite Lachine, on the St. Lawrence. Six Nations on the Grand River are composed of the Indians who followed the Empire Loyalists of Canada. Most of the Cayugas, some Onondagas, small number of Senecas, and a large group of Mohawks. There are no Oneidas there. Some on the Thames River, and the others are going to Wisconsin. I never did any Oneida work, actually.
But you learned Seneca.
Well, I learned Seneca so I could work with it.
Yeah. Did you learn any others you could work with?
I learned Doggett to a certain extent, so I could take text.
That's a pretty heavy one.
And then I did some work with him. I did, we had one of my informants was both Onondaga and Cayuga, and so I did get into the voiceless vowels that you don't hear.
Yeah, because I took
The whispered syllables.
I took a course with Floyd Lounsbury.
Oh, did you?
Yes, and he used his own Oneida material.
Oh, yeah.
Most voiceless vowels.
Yeah.
I've forgotten it now, but for about 10 years after I took that course, I remember the beginning 2 lines of this text of Oneida.
What is it?
Anyway, it was just full of these voiceless vowels.
I see, yeah.
No one could pronounce but Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
But tell me, what about the evolution of Iroquois studies? I mean, you said that there wasn't much going on since Morgan, and then maybe a little bit of Goldenwise.
Well, your dad was a contemporary of Frank Speck's at Pennsylvania.
Gotcha.
While I was a graduate student, in fact, after my first year in the field, fall of 33 or spring of 34, your dad said, go down and see Frank Speck. He can help you. And I went down and climbed the stairs at College Hall, a little rickety building. I'll never forget the waiting, the door was locked. I had an appointment with Speck, and he wasn't there. But in the window, little apsy window there, was this elf of a man sitting there with his knees drawn up to his chin. I spoke to him, he had a real down east voice. And I said, I'm here to see Professor Speck. He said, so am I. He said, my name's Swanton. And he says, Speck is the greatest living ethnologist, greatest field worker. And, well, Swanton stayed around after Speck came for a little while, and then he departed. He was just there to convey his greetings. And I spent a day with Speck, and that was the first of many days like that, where we shared materials that I was collecting in the field, and he showed me the protocol he was using for the study of the ceremonies at the Upper Cayuga Longhouse, and that gave me an idea of how to systematize my material on the Seneca ceremonies, and I discovered a basic pattern in those things that guided all of them, and which really was the structural thing, that just like a grammatical structure that they held unconsciously, but which invariably they insisted on. And Speck was an enormous help. Well, years later when I was at St. Lawrence, Speck came up to talk at Hamilton College, and I went down to hear him, and we talked about the need for some sort of a get-together of the people in the Iroquois studies and related fields, so we could sort of outline the major problems and so forth. And meanwhile, I had written a paper for the Swanton volume on problems arising in the northeastern position of the Iroquois, which I'd gone through all the literature and tried to pull it together and find out what the major research problems were. So the upshot of that was we started the Conference on Iroquois Study, or Conference on Iroquois Research in 1945. We thought it would just run, for a couple of years. It never had any formal funding. Nobody ever got a grant to come to it. It had no formal structure, but it's gone on ever since. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it meets Columbus Day weekend at Rensselaerville in Albany County. There's a study center there. And so that's it.
How about, what were the people who came in to Iroquois studies? Who were the first ones?
Tony Wallace.
Yeah.
Anna Marie Shimoni under Floyd.
And of course,
Floyd himself was already in it.
Do you have quite a big bunch now again?
Well, there have always been about 40 people that show up. And at first it was very heavily in ethnology, and then in archaeology, and now in linguistics. Substantial work has been done on the languages, mainly by Floyd students. Marianne Methune, Honey Woodbury, Mike Foster. Mike is only peripherally influenced by Floyd, and so forth. And, so I'd say Iroquois linguistics, which were zilch, are now really in good shape.
How are the anthropologists, I mean, how do they work with the Iroquois? I mean, the Iroquois accept them, or is it just case by case?
Well, it's a case by case thing. Everyone makes his own way.
Yeah, you're telling me that you've sort of gone through this cycle with this younger generation.
Well, it was, after Vine Deloria wrote his Custer Died for Your Sins, what my colleague and interpreter Howard Sky, Kiyugi, used to call the now Indians, who discovered they were Indians a week ago, want to, they were rather hostile toward anthropologists. They felt we'd exploited them. I had made them, for instance, I'd been accused of making my career at their expense. I remember one occasion where I really got it going after I was working with Howard Sky on the Dagana Wheat Epic, the origin of the Confederacy, translating this long text the Golden Elijah collected. And I volunteered to give a slideshow down at the Onondaga Longhouse in Six Nations Reserve, which I did. Some people came in late, as Indians will, and meanwhile the projector jammed, as they sometimes do. So I was trying to fix the lantern, and suddenly this guy said, "Aren't you the guy here that came here with a sound truck and took away all our songs and didn't pay the people?" I said, "No, they were all paid." And she said, "What were they paid?" I said, "They were paid the prevailing wage at the time." He said, "What was that?" And I said, "You know as well as I do, because you were alive then." So then he got into this big spiel. Once he got his teeth.
What year was that?
Oh, this was 1970. About, roughly.
And this was referring back to what time?
Oh, 1940.
30 years before?
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, when I had that sound truck up there, that was the biggest thing that ever hit the reservation, because I trained some Indians to run it for me, and it got to be it was the local game, everybody wanted to sing. And it just drew singers like a barrel of beer. And well, anyway, I said, "Well, I obviously haven't gotten any place." I said, "Look," I said, "I drive an old car. I still got the same wife." Quite obviously, he said, "I'm not going to." Their lawyer had been there that day in a rented limousine, Yeah. So I said, "I don't know who's exploiting you. I'm not." Well, look, it's 10 o'clock. Have we covered the...
And we can keep on going forever, but...
well, I suppose we could. Well, I've got to give a paper in the morning. And, I about had it.
Okay. Why don't we slow down here?